For Session Update, I'm Shannon Loehrke. Budget priorities and figures have been released by the Governor, the Senate DFL, and the House Republican leadership. Joining me in the studio today to talk about his perspective on budget matters is the Senate Minority Leader David Hann. Welcome, Senator.
Good to be here.
So if you were in the majority and you had a $900 million surplus,
right,
what would you do with it?
Well, I think we've tried to make our priority choices pretty clear. And from our members' perspective, there are two things that we need to do this year. One is to provide meaningful tax relief, and the other is to do a transportation bill. And so if I were the majority leader, we would be focusing our energies and our efforts on doing that, and the surplus dollars would be employed to achieve those ends.
Tax relief is a very broad category. Can you be more specific about where you would point those dollars?
Well, there's a number of things and a lot of ideas, but we think a couple of things have been talked about quite a lot by our members, one of which is to provide tax relief to our senior citizens, in other words, not double tax the Social Security benefit. We're one of the few states that does tax Social Security benefits. A lot of people, a lot of Minnesotans are affected by that. We're trying to make our state a more friendly, more warm state, even though we're not the warmest in climate. We want to be warm and make sure people feel like they are encouraged to be here, and that would be one way to do that. We've also talked about providing relief to our veterans by not taxing their military pensions. Again, one of the few states in the United States that does that. We've also talked a lot about providing tax relief in the form of the statewide business property tax, which again, we're one of the only states that does that. It's an additional tax beyond the normal local property taxes that all businesses pay. Huge impediment to the investment climate in Minnesota.
So you also, in one of the documents I looked at, suggested lowering property taxes on agricultural land. Why prioritize agricultural land?
Well, I think the challenge there is that in rural Minnesota, where you have districts that in some cases, not in every case, the big properties are charged on the value of the entire property. And some of the things that we do in education funding, we only look at the homestead. And so I think the comment here, the support here was for the idea of let's have some uniformity in how we assess property. If you have a small community and you're trying to find a way to fund education, it's a little burdensome to say that just because you have a large farm and you have a lot of property, that burden should be bigger for you than it is for a family that may live in town with a smaller property. So I think it's an equity issue and a question of how do you most fairly get the support of the community that you serve in terms of the property taxes that are levied locally.
The Finance Committee later today is going to work on the $91 million for equity. Do you have a comment on that work and on those initiatives?
Well, we haven't seen yet. They're doing some more work today in the committee, but in fact, I just had a meeting this morning with some of the leaders in the African American community in Minneapolis who are questioning some of the things that are being proposed from the standpoint of how effective are the things that we've done in the past in actually providing help to the people who need help. And I think that is the question. We have to look, I think, very closely at the things that we're putting in place and ask, are we really going to see the benefits that we hope for? I think there's broad support for let's find ways to help people improve the economic climate in Minneapolis, in all places in the state for that matter, but certainly there. And part of it is the money we're using having an effect. And I think secondly, you can't have this conversation without at least talking about the need for improvement in the education system in Minneapolis and getting better results, making sure more kids graduate and the ones that do have got the basic skills that we need.
So when it comes to education, your caucus has proposed education savings accounts for low income and special needs. How would these savings accounts help areas with racial disparities? Well,
education, of course, is a longer-term project. You know, we are seeing the benefits today of education failure from the last 10, 15, 20 years. So in addition to the things that we can do today, we have to take a longer view and make sure that we're providing great educational opportunities for young people so as they get through that system, they come out prepared to solve that, if you will, that employment gap or the income gap. And I think things like education savings accounts, that is designed especially for kids that have disabilities, but the idea can be more broadly applied as it was in Nevada earlier this year. But the point of these is to make sure that families have the ability to make meaningful choices about their kids' school. If they're not happy with the things that they're seeing in the school that is local, if there's another school, maybe it's a private school or some other choice, that they have the ability to exercise that choice. That's really what these ideas are for, is to give people the incentive or at least not a penalty for making a choice other than the traditional public school that happens to be in their neighborhood.
Both the Senate DFL and the governor have proposed significant amounts of money for broadband expansion in rural Minnesota. How would your caucus address broadband expansion?
Well, I think there's support for broadband expansion. I think it's really a question of how much we need to do and what is the economic challenges of that. It's a very, very expensive prospect to put wires in the ground all over the state. I've talked to a lot of the providers, and what they're telling me is that they've got to the point where we've reached almost every community where you've got a reasonable 50-50 kind of match, where you've got a partnership between the providers and state government to pay for the cost. But once you put these things in place, then there's an ongoing cost to maintain them, and the technology moves very rapidly. The fear is that if we build these things all over the state in places where it doesn't make good economic sense, in 5 years when you have to redo it, where is that money going to come from? And so the idea of having partnerships with the providers is that they already have a commitment to invest in the infrastructure going forward. We just have to make sure we don't sort of outrun the coverage on this issue and make sure we've got good partners that have an economic stake in keeping this infrastructure in place.
So one last question. One idea put forth by Senate Republicans would allow lower income families to shop for private insurance on the exchange rather than relying on state programs.
Right.
Would your proposal also eliminate the high deductible plans that are generally the cheaper option, which essentially means people don't have insurance? It's catastrophic in nature.
Well, I think the whole insurance issue has gotten much more complicated and I think frankly more difficult since we've gone down this ACA path and with the MNsure structure we've put in place. What we're trying to find in our caucus are ways to help people more directly. Things like offering a grant or a voucher, or however you want to describe it, that would allow people to access insurance directly rather than going through a bureaucratic and in many cases a hardly accessible process to try to find insurance. The structure of insurance itself, this is one of the things that we've done, is that there's actually been a very, very small number of people who have benefited from this MNsure subsidy structure, less than 1%. The vast majority are seeing higher premiums, higher deductibles, and restriction in their options in the healthcare market because of this change. We need to rethink this a little bit. We need to provide more options. We need to find ways to lower premiums, and part of that is the structure of what we've done. So I think the intention that we all went down a few years ago to make sure that everybody had access to insurance is a great idea. We already had in Minnesota most of that solved. But we have to look at what causes the prices of insurance policies to go up. In a lot of cases, it's mandates. In a lot of cases, it's the structure that we have adopted through the ACA. So we're looking at ways that we can provide some short-term relief, given that we still have the federal law, to make premiums more affordable. And that, in effect, we believe will make accessibility more broad. We've got a lot of work to do on this. Our hands are a little bit tied by this federal law. There's things that we would like to do that we're going to have to go to the federal government and say, please let us do it. We have to get permission. That to me is a very bad thing. We ought to change that at least. Allow states to make decisions in Minnesota that affect people in Minnesota.
Senator Hann, I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming by today.
Good to be here.